Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, to the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. You can support me on local Subscribe Star and Buy Me a Coffee, as well as checking out my local or my Substack. So I was a guest at the recent Scyldings meetup in Tennessee, and today will be a recap of the whole event, which will broadly be divided into three categories. When I call the environment, or sort of the ambiance of being there with the people, the big ideas, the sort of interesting takeaways that I have, and then the meta, which is sort of like where we sit situated, I guess, vis-a-vis ourselves and vis-a-vis the world historical forces at work. So we can begin sort of just with the environment. One of the things that was said there by other people is that, here, just know everybody's up to speed. You don't have to wait for other people to catch up. You don't have to go into a huge, hour-long backlog of explaining everything before you get to the point. Everybody was generally pretty high IQ. So in that regard, it was very easy to get conversation started and hit the ground running. You also didn't have to hide your power level, because these are people that think a lot like you, or if they don't think exactly like you, they think enough like you that you don't have to actually hide anything, which is so refreshing, because I'm sure all of us throughout our lives have to hide and limit our power levels because the society as a whole doesn't really allow for that. And I think that's one of the most rewarding elements of the meetup, was that you could sort of just be yourself. Obviously you still had to pay attention because there were non-attendees there who were also on vacation. But overall, you could basically just be yourself, and people were going to allow you to be yourself, which was really refreshing. Probably one of the most refreshing elements of that meetup, or that I should say that conference. The other thing was there was all sorts of high-level, interesting conversations. So, for example, George Bagby and I talked a lot about the Civil War. Specifically, I sort of made my pitch on interpretations of the legacy and reputation of certain Civil War generals, who I think need to be revised and amended. I did that a couple of years ago with Fulwar Skipworth and the Ghost, Mencken's Ghost. So I just sort of gave a TLDR, a breakdown of that discussion. And that was great. That was fun. And just broader, more Civil War history. I was able to meet a lot of the online Anons that I've talked to before in real life. That was great. I talked about my theory that I broached with Derek Jensen, and we'll talk with him later this summer, the idea that modern technology is in some sense the result of and guided by a supra intelligence, which is malevolent. So the running gag was, I'm not saying it's demons, but it's demons. Anybody who was there for those discussions would know. And then for the other people that were there was the hashtag Lovecraft gang, talked about Lovecraft with some people. Hashtag Baudrillard gang, talked to some people about that. I also got to explain to other people the Wall Street conspiracy that Anthony Sutton points out. And, some people might have seen some of the videos, but I was able to go into more detail to explain more broadly how Anthony Sutton's production of, quote, literal receipts of Wall Street selling goods and services to people that we would think would be otherwise hostile to Wall Street, Hitler, FDR, and the Soviets. But yet, he has the documentation of the transactions or the communiques. So this is really hard evidence to ignore, which creates a very serious wrinkle in our understanding of the 20th century. One of my goals in starting this channel and engaging with this broader community was to bring to light little known and forgotten geniuses. People like Ellul, people like Sutton. And in so many ways, I was successful because, one, people who knew me for some of those things. Most people knew me for my attacks on Moldbug, which was to be expected. So in this regard, it was a success for me. On the one hand, when I saw that Moldbug was losing his fan base with his shoveling of coal on the Grey Mirror, especially as Hobbits and Elves essay, I thought this is the time. And so Logos and I did the hard work in the trenches to go through the first year of UR, 2007. And that got a lot of attention. right? Because it wasn't your normal takedown of Moldbug. It was going after Moldbug in a very meticulous, serious fashion. Dave, in one of his long form streams before the meetup, said that this was the then best attack or a deconstruction of Moldbug's thought. So quite a compliment from Dave there. And so we have that, but then, so I did that in part because I had my own reasons for being opposed to Moldbug, but also in order to get clout, right? One of the classic ways to get clout is you go after somebody who's bigger than you. And it worked. I mean, it worked, right? I got invited to the conference. So in that regard, that was a success for me. Also, being able to introduce people through my channel and then directly to people like Anthony Sutton and Alul, again, is a success for me. This is exactly the kind of thing that I wanted to do, because these are ideas and thinkers that are, totally unknown and undervalued, and should be common names. And hopefully, I can make that I can help make that possible. Because these names and their ideas are extremely important in understanding how we got here and why we're in this mess. It was a lot like, in many ways, a Greek symposium. You had all these high energy, intelligent guys to talk to, and just bounce ideas off of each other. It was great. I'm reminded of the Radlibs review in 2022 of the previous Scyldings event, where they said that people in real life were not too different from their online personas, which made it easier to interact with them, right? You could basically have a set of expectations that these people were predictable in just the ways you would have imagined, and they were. And I can say from being at the present event, that is exactly the case, I was hoping that would be the case, and I was pleasantly surprised and to see that it was. The other thing is, it was out of, I think, something over like 100 people. Maybe I heard from one of the organizers it might have been 120 at most. I was able to hang out and talk to on a fairly regular basis, maybe about a third of that number. At least it felt like it, which was quite surprising. I had a lot more fans in real life than I realized, which was very nice to see. Almost a day didn't go by before somebody was like, "Oh, wow, your Praise of Flight podcast. I love your channel." It was really, really nice to see how many people I was able to reach and how they appreciated the content. So hopefully we can keep this going and keep the connections going. And importantly, making connections with people that are already there, right? Because what we don't have, and this was at a universal agreement at the conference, is basically a network for like-minded people to do things. And so I think in that regard, as a second order goal, that was, the more of the collective goal, it was also a success because it did that. Now, some of the interesting ideas, the big ideas from the talks, I think for me, the most interesting one was about Orrin McIntyre, because he said things in a way that I think was letting on more than it first appeared, right? So in his discussion on managerialism and the woke, he used the term efficiency quite a few times, and that the system of managerialism seeks to maximize efficiency. Now, I immediately jumped to Jacques Ellul and his definition of technique, which is this process of maximizing efficiency. He also discussed how the rising cost of energy due to energy scarcity will cause troubles for the system, a la Tainter and Greer, collapse build. Is Orrin McIntyre behind the scenes reading Ellul, Greer, and Tainter under the pillows with the flashlights so that, the official normie conservatives don't know? And he's, using normie conservative terms to get it out there. It's a lot cooler to think that. So, until one way or the other is confirmed, to sort of paraphrase what Paul says to King Agrippa, you are not far from, or sorry, no, that's wrong way. To paraphrase what he says to Festus, I wish all men were as I except for these chains. So it seems that Orrin is close. And again, I know, being a public intellectual, there's certain things that are difficult to say because of your situation in your audience. But I do wonder if he's been reading those guys. It sort of sounded like it, which was an interesting and unexpected thing to see. Also, his point about the conservative Paul the Ratchet was absolutely correct. Like waves on a beach in the tide, they never go back as far as they did before this change occurred. Reminded me of the statement by Robert Louis Dabney on conservatism, which for those of you that watched my last Moldbug Matrix video, or my second to last, where I summarized the Puritan thesis I ended with an extensive reading of that quotation by Robert Louis Dabney. Dave's speech, of course, was another interesting one. He was basically the make fun of boomer speech. And he mentioned the Hawaiian Islanders not reacting to Cook's ship as a kind of boomer moment. And I also thought at the time it kind of reminded me of how the Amerindians and the Europeans met. The Europeans just sort of broke all of the expectations of Native Americans. On the one hand, there was a belief system that they had, at least in Mesoamerica and Peru, that allowed some room for the Europeans, the idea of the white god, Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha. But on the other hand, they had ships, they had horses, they had guns, literally everything the Native Americans had, everything the Europeans had, completely broke the Native Americans, plus the diseases. And so you can envision them, praying to their gods, and nobody gets better from the illnesses, and they're being defeated in battle. In many ways, that long defeat, which lasted maybe a century, it mirrors the sort of feeling that modern boomers have, and was in Dave's speech. Also, Dave graciously mentioned the work Logos and I did in reviewing his debate with Matt McManus, which is appreciated. And so, yeah, that was another interesting talk. I briefly was able to have a chat with Dave over, I think it was the Saturday breakfast, where we talked a little bit about some of the insights that I've derived from Sutton. So that was fun. We'll see if we see more of that. Also, Charlie, good old Charlemagne, as a gift, bought me a copy of Erasmus's Praise of Folly, which is a very appropriate gift given my channel name. So for those who don't know, I read, probably 15 years ago, Erasmus's Praise of Folly, which is a Renaissance humanist critique of the Catholic Church. Mind you, Erasmus is still Catholic, though. And I chose that as my title. And, of course, he then got a copy of that, which was a very, I think, appropriate gift given the nature of how this all got started. Curtis, Not Me, Not You. I think what I really appreciated from his talk was the idea of male friendships, which are sort of under attack on a whole host of fronts. Because, again, to quote Aristotle, civic life is the result of men unified together over the common bond of philia. And if you don't have that, then you don't have civil life. Hence, we don't have civil life today. And so that was much appreciated. I thought Mike of Pole made a good point with living in the cracks or in the blind spots of the eye of Sauron. In many regards, that sort of aligns with what I've been saying. I've been saying that, well, look, the best way to deal with the regulatory system, the state, woke capital, and all these other problems, they all operate within a certain paradigm, a certain assumption of the way the world works. And if you can step outside of that, you literally become invisible to them. So what do I mean by this? Well, everybody in these positions is thinking in terms of game theory. Well, if you step outside of the game theory assumptions and act on a different motivation entirely, as we saw how do I want to put this? The austere Afghan theocratic resistance, then they win because they stepped outside of the basis of rational action that the Western elites assumed. Also, there's what many Marxist critics have called capitalist realism, which is the idea that the triumph of capitalism was inevitable. There was no other possible course the West could have chosen. That there's no possible future after capitalism. If that's in fact the case, and that's how the system operates, then if you don't act that way, you've effectively stepped outside their frame of view. And so they can't see you. And so I really thought that was an interesting point as well that he made, and definitely dovetails with a lot of my thinking on the matter. And what's interesting here is that, there's a sense now in which we've come a long way, right? In the sense that a lot of the antisocial behavior, a lot of the naivete, a lot of the giving yourself a black eye is kind of gone. People are, the word I use is chastened. They're more chastened because of all of the previous failures that have occurred. They have a more sober, clear-minded attitude, which I think is much needed. And hopefully we can continue to see that grow as an idea. and as a praxis within this group. And when we look at the big ideas of the talks, there's sort of I guess a few things we could say as an overall rubric. There's an attempt at trying to come to a sense of a higher praxis. And this sort of ties into one of the things that I brought up before, like on the Lambda server stream and others. On the left, there's something magical about the name of Marx, right? Whether you're a feminist or a tanky or an environmentalist or whatever, as soon as his name gets, dropped, everybody falls into line in the phalanx and fights their, side of the culture war. Well, at least they used to. There seems to be splits now that are developing. And that was in part because for the left, Marx offers this very high-level strategic analysis of history and the world and economics, that whatever your subdivisions and focuses and nuances are, you all agree on that, at least in principle. And there's currently nothing like that on the right yet, though I think it is possible to have something like that. And I do think that the perceived need is growing, which is important. I think that's one thing we can get from all the big ideas of these talks. The other thing is the importance of closer working together. Right. Obviously, we're sort of all scattered over the country. We can't really live the kind of lives that we would like to live because we're constrained by various aspects of the system as it is. That's going to take a long time to solve. But the fact that it's even perceived as a problem and it needs to be solved is the first step, right? Because in Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step to recovery is admitting you have a problem with alcohol. So in that case, we also could see that all of these talks were underneath the broader assumption that a more closer affiliation is needed, which also led to the discussion, I forget who the speaker was, about how to sort of police against, infiltrators and spurgs and other things like that, which, again, it was more to point out the need to do that rather than to actually have a rigorous process of doing it. But okay, fine. I think one of the criteria was showing up. If you're willing to show up, then you're either a really dedicated infiltrator or you're the real deal, which I guess by itself wouldn't be enough, but it is probably an evidence of somebody being serious. One of the sort of joking refrains was a paraphrasing of Marx from the Communist Manifesto. He says, "A specter haunts Europe." And from my point of view, I'd say a specter was haunting the conference, the specter of anomie. Anomie is a term invented by the French sociologist Émile Durkheim, and it refers to social instability resulting from a breakdown of standards and values, and to personal unrest, alienation, and uncertainty that comes from a lack of purpose or ideas. I think both senses of the term were present at that conference. So we're all dealing with both aspects of anomie, and the latter feeling is the result of the first. I believe that we are between two ages. An old age is dying and a new one is being born. The nature of this new age can only be dimly glimpsed by prophets, poets, and philosophers. And our individual sense of anomie is, I believe, directly correlated to our ties to the old dying world. What I mean by this is that the more we have an identity formed by the old dying world, the worse our anomie will be. The more we build an identity in the new world being born, the less that sense will be. My goal, and I think the goal of this conference, was to form a new model for this new age. For me personally, the key to navigating this new age is observing throughout history all of the patterns that repeat independently of ethnicity, class, sex, geography, or time, and apply them to yourself to give you the maximal chances of success. So one of the things that sort of leads into this is by 2006, and I've said this before in other episodes, but it bears repeating. When I went to college, I had, a more or less working knowledge of the course of Western history from, Egypt to the War on Terror, because, that was the cutting edge of our history back in 2006. And I noticed there were all sorts of patterns of behavior that transcended any of the contingent historical limitations. And a lot of these principles were no longer working, or at least appeared not to work. And I was like, well, why? This is really crazy, really bizarre, because they did work for all these other years, aeons, centuries, millennia. And that led to me to eventually come to the conclusion through years of study that the modern state, that was probably the contribution of libertarianism. The idea of modern finance, which is probably the contributions of the socialists, and then an anti-technology critique, which is the contributions of the environmentalists, all in tandem provide this radically new society that creates the illusion that the old ways don't work. But see, the old ways actually do work. It's just that we've constructed this false paradigm based on energy consumption, which cannot be maintained. And even Oren mentioned in his talk is running out of energy because it's getting more expensive, which will then begin the process of contraction, which will then begin to punish people, not the system itself, but reality itself as it imposes a new order, will punish people for holding these beliefs that are the product of the machine rather than reality. And so if you can determine the beliefs and actions, so beliefs and praxis, that are true, that are derived from the principles of reality rather than the principles of the machine, you will be most well positioned to survive what's coming. And we're all at various stages of decoupling from the machine. We all know that we've imbibed beliefs that are false. Some of us might disagree on what those false beliefs are. Some of us are further along, which of course leads to anomie. But the point is, there's a way. Okay, anomie is like pain. It's like putting your hand on a burner. It hurts, but it's telling you to do something. In this case, to change. Now, how do you change? That could be a whole set of videos all by itself. But nonetheless, I think that this is, quote, the specter that is haunting all of this. And one of the things that will help facilitate this, of course, is more closer collaboration, which is the overall theme of all the speakers rather, and coming to imbibe and understand these ideas. It's partly why I spent a lot of time for everybody who was there for those conversations to talk about a lot of these things, like the technological system itself, the works of Sutton, and how Wall Street finances all these different seemingly competing and contradictory factions throughout world history, or throughout the last century, I should say, and even today. So we see the fact that, the U.S. is supporting Ukraine, and many people on both the left and the right have pointed out, well, the Ukrainians have certain unsavory nationalist types. Yeah, well, Mr. Mustache himself was funded by Wall Street at one point. So this isn't really a surprise, or at least shouldn't be, to people in this sphere. And I think the positive takeaway is that the problems that have existed for a long time are finally beginning to be acknowledged, right? You can't address a problem until you admit there's a problem. And so one of the, I think, positive elements of this meetup was that people were willing to admit that, yes, these are a set of problems that have to be dealt with. So, and then steps will be taken to deal with them. So first of all, they admit that there are problems, which, if you were to say 5 or 10 years ago in this circle, they would maybe not have admitted, which is, I think, a big step in the right direction. I think there are more problems that need to be admitted to than are currently, but it looks like that the path to get to that point we're on, which is good, right? Because we don't get to this all at once. Some of us are further along than others, but it looks like we're on the right trajectory to come to these terms. Because before anybody can take any serious action to survive and manage what's coming, we first need to know what is the state of the game, so to speak, that we're playing, and what we can likely assume to be the case in the future, to then make plans that will hopefully survive long enough to at least be adapted and modified to survive the new changing environment. And again, I think the next conference will likely further push that agenda forward. We can get to more discussions like this. So I think that in that regard, it was a success as well. The actual event was very well catered. It was very well attended. And again, I just go back to the fact that it was so nice to just be able to be yourself. You didn't have to look over your shoulder and worry that, is this going to cause somebody to freak out, or are you going to lose your job? I mean, after all, right, we already knew a few people there who did lose their job. And so they then gave their stories. So that was interesting. And the level of camaraderie, right? I mean, obviously these are people that I don't really know personally, though some of them I do know online. We kind of stepped into like a friend group, like we've been friends for a while, which I think was very interesting as well. You know, to have that kind of, because what ends up happening is what we share is a shared sense of goals, at least in a broad sense, to somehow return to something more natural and normal and get outside of the system itself. Okay, that's a shared goal. We've all been burned to varying degrees by the system, so that's the shared experience of suffering, which, you know, even if I hadn't known you 5 minutes before, that's enough to bring us all together in some level of camaraderie. But again, is a very unusual place for me to be, at least because I haven't really been there, and it was it was an incredible feeling to actually have that. And so, yeah, I think that that's the main thoughts that I have about how the event was. You know, the environment itself, sort of big ideas that I got from the talks, and a broader specter haunting the conference. I know we have some people in the chat. Baron Gimli von Garden for $10 US. Our discussion on pacifism versus pragmatism was highlight of the event for me. My sincere wish is that devout Christians can disagree without losing sight of who we all serve. Thank you and God bless. There you go, Gimli. Thank you. Yeah, we all know. If you were at the conference, we all know who Gimli is. Yeah, so I actually had, over the many meal sessions we had there were quite a few in which we were seated together, and we talked about a whole bunch of different issues, and that was one of them. You know, how should Christians relate to the world as a whole? The one thing that we did agree is that tactically we all have to take this more indirect, unobtrusive perspective. The question then that was the dividing issue was if and when things change, what we ought to do about that. I just kind of related to this, really interesting too. There was this, I don't remember his name, but probably wouldn't matter because, you know, want to keep anonymity. There was this veteran who had stepped out of the military because of the COVID mandates. And he said that he had watched my videos on Sutton, pointing out that the Soviets were backed by Wall Street, which cast doubts on the entire point of the Cold War. And since that seemed to have been a part of the motivating propaganda for him to join, he sort of, repudiated any attempt to get back in, which, from my point of view, is a huge success. That's great. We're starving the beast of personnel, right? And you do it with the truth. You tell them that they're fighting for a lie. And it was really cool to see that this guy was like, I believe these lies. No one had told me the truth. And then seeing this, I changed my perspective. It was really, really cool. So I see Jay Ford's in the chat, Nathan CJ Hood, and Vultra. Thank you. Oh, yeah, not me, not you. It was great to meet you, my dude. The speaker you mentioned gatekeeping was Essa. Oh, thank you. Oh, yes, lots of Uncle Ted. Imperator of Forge. Could gender identity be considered class warfare? Could it? Yeah, I think it could be considered, because if you look at the Whole Foods heat map, if you're homogeneous, and by that I mean basically white male working class, and you make it diverse, which means everything other than that, well, you've just destroyed unions, and that's the whole point. So yes, it is a form of class warfare. Also, Imperator of Forge, Uncle Ted was right. Yeah, perfect. Jay Ford had a fun discussion in the cart. Yeah, that was good too. We talked a lot about possible future strategies. I mean, I remember one of the things that I mentioned. We all sort of have different goals in mind. First of all, what do we want in the short term? What do we want in the medium term? What do we want in the long term? And the long term could be long term for your life, or long term is in like a century or two. One of the things that I mentioned to Jay Ford was, my ultimate goal is to, at some point, not have to teach online. Because right now, this is kind of my teaching platform because that's all that's available to me. But to someday be able to teach an actual group of students face-to-face in an actual, doesn't have to be an institution per se, but in an actual schoolroom would be the ultimate goal, at least for like a profession or a career. We have another super chat from Nathan C.J. Hood for 2 English pounds. Thank you. What will the future cooperation look like? Well, that's a big question. There's a lot of ways to unpack that, so let's do so. We'll sort of work from the highest level all the way down. The first thing is, I've already mentioned there needs to be some sort of unifying intellectual principle that stands over and above the discrete differences between, say, like Christians and pagans, or Christians and atheists, and Catholics and Protestants. All the basic disagreements, which at the conference were kept pretty down low, which is good, because otherwise it would have been a crap show if that had come up. Then the other thing is, and for me, I believe that is an essential core of that is going to be being able to properly identify how the power structures actually work, hence my beef with Moldbug and libertarians, and beginning with properly constructing that. And so just for example, I would say that let's start with the big three, right? And nature of origin. Finance, because that begins in the late medieval era and Renaissance with the Italian city-states, the rise of the state itself, and then modern technology. All three of these are very important ruling paradigms in our society that impose various costs and limits and inhibitions on us. But those are the things that control us. And they control us in very specific ways. The basic premise of the market, going back to the Frederick C. Howe Confession of a Monopolist, is make the other guy pay. And as I've pointed out already, both at the conference and on previous videos, the middle-class business owner does this just as much as the George Soroses of the world, right? They're going to make the customer pay by raising prices. They're going to make the worker pay by firing the worker or giving them reduced hours or cutting benefits. The state imposes costs by the use of direct force. So the police, the military, and technical civilization imposes a whole variety of costs based on, in a nutshell, forcing us to live a way of life that is useful for it, but not useful for us. I've gone into all these in detail elsewhere. And later on, I think it's Saturday, I'm going to be talking with Keith Pressman, where I outline this broad theory of how these three institutions arose and how they control us. So look forward to that. That's sort of the beginning. And I think there's other relevant adjacent concepts that can buttress that can create a framework of a sort of global strategic analysis that could fit the role on the right that Marx does on the left. And as I jokingly said to Red Hawk in our debate and not debate, but the conversation I had on Yuz's channel, I'm positioning myself higher up in the hierarchy in order to do that. And the way that would work is at the end of the day, I believe that what I offer is an accurate description of reality. And anybody who has beliefs that are not actually corresponding to the way the world is now and will be in the next 5, 10, 20 years will just be a non-issue, because reality will impose certain constraints on them that they either will be forced to change their beliefs or perish. And so ultimately, it's more just like putting it out there and just sitting and waiting. That's sort of how I view of it. That's one level. I think the other level would be, which the conference I think did a pretty good job already, is just having this sort of don't pick fights with each other. Charles Haywood has said no enemies to the right. Yes. Also, Ryan Turnipseed has confederalism. Just have this idea where you don't needlessly antagonize each other. So, but basically, best principles. Write down a code of best principles. As well as developing some form of mutual aid to help people out. So I think all three of those at like the most abstract level would be some way of working together and how that would look. Jay Ford, you also channeled with Bagby. Was that fruitful? Yeah, we talked a lot about history mostly, and mostly Civil War history, because I knew that was his big interest of his, and it's also a big interest of mine. So I think minimally what we can say is we show that we had a lot in common, mutual respect for our intellectual effort to master the field. So yeah, that was really good. TB9K, we have to look to the non-resistant sects of Christianity for an insight, even if we don't hold that view. Yeah, that was basically what Mr. Baron Gimli said earlier at the conference. Whether or not you believe it as a sort of primary belief, it has to be a assumed tactical, practical reality. So that's another reason why I think that this what I'm bringing to the table is useful for everyone, because whether you believe it as a sort of first principle or a religious commitment is kind of irrelevant, because it's the only option we have. It's like how the Velvet Revolution of the Soviet Union was essentially nonviolent. It had to be, because if it wasn't, it'd be crushed. So, Minoan, did you buy a Bagby bow tie? No, Minoan, I did not. I do not wear bow ties. Let's see. Imperator of Force. The main strength the left possesses is their over-reliance on advanced tech. For atheism, a scientific utopia is their fantasy. Right. Well, whether you're an atheist, a Marxist, or a libertarian, your worldview is very out of step with reality as it historically was up until the Industrial Revolution. Hence why all these were really Industrial Revolution ideas. But as we enter into collapse, and again, I use this in the technical tainter sense, going from a high energy to a lower energy state, which once that process ends will be at a below equilibrium, because whatever the equilibrium was before, well, we've exhausted the environment we're living on. So it'll be below the previous equilibrium of, say, 1800. Well, once that process ends, we'll be at an energy state of below equilibrium. Or a new one, I guess. I mean, the previous equilibrium of 200 years ago is long gone. But yeah, in that regard, none of these would work. We would expect to see all of these ideas go away, because these are luxuries of a high energy state, which means cheap energy. They're luxuries of cheap energy. Once that goes back, they're done. But Minoan's not happy. I don't wear bow ties. Well, I don't. I don't, Minoan. Let's see. What else do we have here? Oh, yeah, there were so many wonderful speakers. Yeah, a lot of one of the passing jokes I had with Curtis, not me, not you, was what's more likely, we're able to get Dave for that three-way discussion on Baudrillard, or Dave finishes the Shrek video. That was one of our inside jokes. Imperator of Forge. I read that has the baby boomers are passing away, their specific art tastes, the post-war is going with them. Yes. Okay, that actually opens up a lot of points of discussion. The money that was generated not only by the elites, the government through taxes, the giant corporations after World War II, by controlling the economy and the big tech, is the result of money being input into the system to drive it. Now, the boomers themselves, as a generation, have the most money. And there's two reasons why we would expect their tastes to go with them. One, those tastes are unique to their experience and their social material conditions which no longer exist. And are not but furthermore, you might say, isn't that overly reductionist? Isn't that overly Marxist? Well, unlike, say, the Iliad or the Old Testament or Shakespeare, which, yes, certain aspects of those societies cannot be reproduced today, they all represent something that is real in a transcendent way, which could be reproduced in the future. I mean, how do we know this? History shows us Alexander the Great viewed himself as the new Achilles. Plutarch says he slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow. So by literally LARPing, live action role playing as Achilles, he conquered an empire. There was something underlyingly true about the Iliad that hundreds of years later could motivate a world conqueror, for example. How many paragons of Christian virtue have imitated Christ? Think of St. Francis of Assisi, for example. That's real. The boomer culture is fake. So the fact that it was the product of a contingent social material conditions means it's done, because there's nothing real behind it. It's a simulation. So there's nothing real behind it that carries it to the future. Oh, see that Jay Ford's leaving the chat. God bless you too, Jay Ford. And so, yeah, but furthermore, their tastes were expensive. Those tastes were the result of cheap energy, which is no longer a future. cheap energy's over. So yeah, that's gone. Same with the Xers, right? We're going to see that too. At least I would expect to see that. Their tastes were relatively expensive given the energy conditions at the time, and a lot of the culture they consumed was totally fake. There's nothing to carry over, it's just fake. And you won't be able to even pretend that it's true. Super chat for $2. Baron Gimli von Garden. Lord of the Rings is the modern Iliad. Yeah, it's the modern epic, and in many ways it does inspire lots of people. Let's see, what was I going to say? Imperative Forge. Oh yeah, taste. So a lot of what we dislike about society, a lot of the garbage and the crap, is the result of 1, cheap energy, 2, the simulation, and 3, material and social conditions that cannot last. So the good news is, as we go into collapse, all of this stuff will go away. That's the good news, and you won't be able to make any more. TB9K, total LARPer vindication. Heck yeah, totally. And LARPing as characters from Lord of the Rings will work because it's a true myth, right? It's not true in the sense that it wasn't an actual historical event. It's myth, but it's true in the sense that it represents eternal universal truths. And that's just what modern culture doesn't do, which is why it won't last, even though the conditions that produced it are, even after the conditions that produced it are gone. But that hasn't been the fate of other great works, because those great works do tap into this universal. So there's that element too, which I think is really, really interesting. And of course, I can't forget to mention the speaker Grant and his English canon and the broader Western canon. That was an interesting conversation. I kind of made the audience laugh when I said that Tolkien is in the canon. And he's like, well, not technically yet. But I'm like, no, he is in a higher metaphysical realm that is true. To sort of like Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia, or sorry, not the Chronicles of Narnia. He talks about it in that Hideous Strength space trilogy. The idea that there's a higher truth, like there's the true China, the true France, the true England, which exists in some metaphysical realm. In that Lewisian sense, Tolkien is in the canon. We just haven't caught up yet. Okay, Paul_B. I'm that soldier. It was great to meet you. If I joined again, 1, I would want payback remunerations, and 2, I would ride physical disability conditions to remain non-deployable. hey, I mean, the system didn't do you or us any favors. Imperator of Forge. And a lot of this artificial nonsense had its precedent in utopian places like Oneida, New York. Yeah, Polly_B, be in the system, but suck it dry. Well, yeah, I mean, it's a system that's killing us, right? This is something else too. So the mindset that you're giving us here, right? One of the things is there's this sort of like, this is an idea that just needs to die, and I'll probably do a video on it at some point. This normie, conservative Christian, libertarian, value of work argument that you just, crucify yourself on the wheel of capital to just, break your back working because it's somehow intrinsically valuable in a system that hates you and is exploiting you. That's a chump move. That's just stupid. You're just keeping the system going that hates you. For all these, quietly quitters, yeah, keep doing it. Keep quietly quitting. This is how this is how we peacefully bring the system down. I mean, like, what would happen if like 50% of the population didn't show up to work tomorrow? I think we can all pretty quickly envision what would happen. Narrative discourse. I'm right at the end of that Hideous Strength right now. I was wondering if you read that one. The space trilogy is a must. Yes, I've read it twice. The first time I read it, I was not very impressed. The third time I read it, I was able to see things the second time I read it, rather, I was able to see things that I missed. So I had a newfound respect for it. I think the narrative doesn't hang together very well from book to book to book, but what does hang together is the ideas. The ideas of each book get redigested and refocused. So in that regard, I think that was a level of connectivity that I didn't quite see. Paul_B, my right shoulder and left knee are not truly the same joints that 19-year-old enlisted. That's not just true for those that enlist in the Army. It's true for those that do the 9-to-5 grind at a factory or at a desk job too. So there's just something wholly unnatural about the way we do this. Baron Gimli von Garden, as far as sucking the policy and drama policy is get W. Let's see, TBK9, THS, and LTR greater than the trad cannon. What's THS? And what do you mean by greater than the trad cannon? Baron Gimli von Garden, a far sucking the system, I thought, is to take whatever you can from the state without compromising morals and becoming dependent. Right. Yeah, I get it. Let's see. Yeah, well, I guess that's another undercurrent, right? We've all read Lewis, we've all read Tolkien, right? They maybe didn't come up overtly very much, but the fact that we all read them at the conference, or at least we're all familiar with them, was also this sort of invisible bond of fraternity, along with the desire to live a more real life, not the simulated machine life we have, and the shared suffering. So that's also really nice when you are with a group of mostly men that have read Lewis and Tolkien and are at least passingly familiar with their work. To, extreme nerds. So yeah, that's great too. And let's see if I can remember any of the other interesting conversations that I had just off the cuff. I mean, I did spend a lot of time talking about the super intelligence that was malevolent that built technology, which I'll get into more detail with Derek Jensen later this year. Okay, TB9K, that hideous strength. It's just top notch in my opinion. Funny deep lore, Tolkien called it that hideous book. He hated it. Tolkien hated it. But he didn't like the Chronicles of Narnia either. He said it was Lewis was mishmashing all these different mythological elements. But yeah. No, that hideous strength was probably the best of the three Space Trilogy books. I think it was the longest of the three, and he definitely goes into a lot of detail about these different elements that occurred. And of course, see, what I like about that hideous strength is it's sort of like the narrative companion to the abolition of man. He talks a lot about how the technological system is dehumanizing. In fact, the technological system is demonic. There's the talking disembodied head. I mean, it's all there. Lewis just gets the whole picture right there in narrative form, rather than the more technical abolition of man, which again is one is the narrative companion to the other. So they pair nicely together. Imperator Forge. I've never seen a single woman or group of women ever conceive to answer existential questions regarding our reality. Yeah, not wrong. Same. Imperator Forge is like sci-fi with religious undertones. Yeah, that was kind of the point. The sci-fi elements were a little bit lighter with Lewis, but the issue then is, how does all of this hold together? And I think what it shows, okay, there's an element. Okay, I'll end with this. I'll end with that hideous strength. In that hideous strength, Mr. Dimble basically talks about how people have choices, or now, I don't know if he's going full predestinarian here or not, but it looks like they have choices. But the longer the game goes, our choices become constrained. Eventually, as he says, you run out of elbow room. You have to make that choice, for or against it, whatever the costs are. And what I believe is that we are moving to a point where we will lose a lot of elbow room, a lot of what I consider to be false beliefs will just wither on the vine. They will be like, a tree branch that's been cut off and dies because the cheap energy that was behind them is gone, and the elbow room that they had to wiggle is gone. And I think to looking forward is that we'll have a lot less elbow room, and that it will force us to make more difficult choices. And a lot of the sort of like frills and nonsense that people still, consider important and still devote, I think, unnecessary energy to will go away. A few more here. I think Lewis sort of narrative discourse. I think Lewis sort of reaches way out there and masterfully makes connections here and there. I'm definitely trying to have, definitely going to have to reread the Space Trilogy. Yes. Imperator Forge, great stream. Okay, everybody, thanks for showing up. And if for those that I was able to meet in public, I'm so glad to have met you. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.